So now let's take some of what we just talked about in the first section and we'll actually apply it to a real life example. Let's imagine that we want to conduct a study. And just to simplify it, I'm going to give us a few variables. Let's imagine that we're interested in gender, listening skills, and anger levels. Now there are all sorts of different ways that you could combine these variables together. In other words, when we're coming up with hypotheses, there are lots of different predictions that we can make. All the way from the most basic, like if we take gender and listening, we could say it's predicted that women will report or will demonstrate higher levels of listening skills than men. We could predict that anger levels decrease listening skills. We could make a prediction about gender and anger, like men are more prone to anger levels. In fact, probably the better way of saying that is men are more prone, to either higher anger levels or lower listening skills than women. So making a comparison between the two genders. We could take a look at the relationship between gender, listening, and anger. And we say something like it's predicted that the more women feel they're listened to, the more their anger levels will decrease. We could say the same thing about men. You could imagine how people practice listening skills. So for instance, it's hypothesized that men who practice listening skills during conflict will feel less angry than those who do not. You could think about the role of stress in anger. And you could even go to the level of moderating relationships. We'll use this as our last one just because it's more complex than we'll dive into in this unit, but it gives us a good idea of what we're going to talk about next in factorial. This is the kind of hypothesis we could examine with a factorial design, which is what we'll talk about in a future lecture. That gender will moderate the relationship between watching an instructional video and listening, such that males will show decreased listening skills after previously watching a video on the same topic. Okay, so all that to say, you can get more and more complex with these hypotheses, but this is just to show there's lots of different predictions we can make with these same three variables. Now let's think about how are we going to measure this? In other words, how are we going to operationalize these variables? Well, I want you to think about stress, for instance. How could you actually measure stress? In fact, what I want you to do is to pause the video here and jot down in the text box below what are 3 different possible ways that you could measure stress. Okay? Here's a couple that I came up with. You could measure physiologically. You could measure heart rate or blood pressure. You could conduct a self-report. You could ask someone, how stressed do you feel right now? You could make an observation, a video recording of someone's facial expressions or their body language. All these are different ways of operationalizing the construct of stress or measuring it. How about anger levels? Again, what I want you to do is jot in the text box below, what are 3 different ways that you could try to measure someone's anger? Pause the video, and when you're done jotting them, come back and we'll finish it. Okay, here's a few examples that I came up with. You could measure the volume of their voice, or you could have someone code what is the tone of their voice. Does it sound angry or not angry? You could measure the frequency of word choice. Are they using aggressive versus passive words? You could ask them, again, in a self-report measure. You could observe their facial expression again. You could look at their reactivity to certain kinds of stimuli. You could measure their pupil dilation, their perspiration. All sorts of different ways that we can operationalize stress and anger here. Now let's think about these exact 2, let's think about anger anyway in particular. Let's take this one variable and let's ask, how could we go about manipulating it? In this previous, on this previous operationalization, we measured it. In other words, we want to know how angry are you? Now we want to know how can we make someone angry? So pause the video and come up with 2 different ways that you could make someone angry. In other words, operationalize the manipulation of anger. Pause the video and we'll come back. Okay, there's all sorts of ways in which you could manipulate anger. Here's a couple that I came up with. You could have them watch a video designed to make them angry. We did this in fact, one of my previous research methods class showed people a video of a harassing police encounter. And what we found was it reliably made people angry with that police officer. You could, if this were an in vivo experiment where someone's actually there, you could have someone bump into another person. You could have them reflect on a time in which they felt angry. All of these are ways to manipulate anger. You could do the same kind of thing for listening skills. You could try to decrease someone's listening skills by presenting them with a distractor. You could measure their interruption. And in other words, you could interrupt them with something. You could give them a measure to interrupt their listening process. You could increase their listening skills by maybe training them to listen better. You could provide them with a video, either instructing in this or having a video going on in the background that interferes with their listening. All that to say, lots of different ways to operationalize these variables. And here, especially to manipulate them. And remember, manipulations are for our independent variables, our IV. Measures are for our dependent variables, our DVs. Okay, so we have measures and manipulations. So now let's get to, let's take one particular hypothesis and we'll run with it a little bit and begin developing our experiment. And then we'll pause and talk a little bit about one of the elements that affects experiments. So let's imagine that this is our hypothesis. We want to design a study that measures and where we can predict two things. First, we predict that on average, men are no worse than women at listening to what others say. In other words, you've had friends tell you men are so bad at listening, and what you want to suggest is, no, I'm going to predict that men are not worse than women. Okay? In other words, men are about equal. We'll kind of give it this one. Men are about equal to women on listening skills. Second, you make a prediction that men will be worse at listening when the speaker is angry. So in other words, increased anger leads to decreased listening, at least for men. Okay. And for women, we're going to suggest there's increased anger leads to no differences. Okay. So here are some specific ways of thinking about those hypotheses. First of all, we have an experimental hypothesis. We want to try to develop an experiment in which a treatment or a manipulation is going to impact an effect or a dependent variable. In other words, the independent variable is going to impact a dependent variable. Second, it's really important, we talked a little bit about this last semester, that when we develop these hypotheses, we think about what is the null hypothesis. In other words, we have an experimental hypothesis and we have a null hypothesis. Last semester, I encouraged you to think about the null hypothesis as the bummer friend who you're talking to at a party who never believes any story that anyone else tells. Someone comes to a party, they tell a story, and the guy says, that's not true, that's not real, that you're making this up. The null hypothesis, in other words, is that there is no relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. Gender doesn't make a difference. Being angry isn't going to decrease your listening skills. Now, what's important to remember is we can never prove the null hypothesis. We are unable to prove the null hypothesis. Okay? So what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video in a second and take a look at these two hypotheses. Okay? Knowing what we know so far, and especially this inability to prove the null hypothesis, does this affect our hypotheses? Does these make any of our two hypotheses bad hypotheses? And jot down your answer in the text box below. It's either yes, and then note is the first hypothesis or the second hypothesis, or no, both those hypotheses are still okay. The second hypothesis is actually incomplete. We can't answer this hypothesis using a simple experiment. Here we wanted to say that men will be worse at listening when the speaker is angry than women. Here we need a factorial design. We need men versus women and angry versus non-angry individuals. Okay, so we need a comparison group, women here, and we need a full factorial design. Okay, but let's imagine we're going to go through and we want to actually test, are men and women any different on these listening skills? So we designed a study. And in trying to figure out first where to get all these guys for your study, you decide to recruit participants from an LA Chargers game because you don't care that they moved from San Diego to LA. You have no loyalty to the San Diego Chargers. You'll go anywhere. So you go up to the LA Chargers. Now, to your surprise and your utter gratitude, you end up getting 150 responses, which is pretty impressive. In your group, you've gathered 135 men and 15 women from the LA Chargers game. In a little bit, I'm going to ask you to think, are there any limitations of this kind of recruitment? Next, what we want to do is we want to collect the dependent variable. In other words, we have a measure. So in this study, remember, we're going to measure listening skills. Remember, these are called dependent variable because an individual's score depends on things. It depends on things like individual characteristics. In other words, someone's listening skills depends on maybe their attentional capacities or their age or their and I was going to say upbringing, but it depends on their personal history, things like their upbringing, how polite was their household, how much were manners emphasized. But, and most importantly, the dependent variable, here listening skills, depends on your manipulation. What you're assuming is people's listening skills will vary depending on which manipulation you get. So my last question for you for this video is, do you have any selection criteria that are going to bias your sample on the dependent variable or variables? Remember, we're thinking about anger and we're thinking about listening skills. Is there any way that we've selected our participants that might bias our sample? In other words, where our sample would be any different from an average sample on either anger or listening skills? And write your answer in the text box below. And after this, you can go to the next video.